Hey, it's Christian with St. Augustine TV. When most of us think about the Revolutionary War, we think of Boston, Lexington, Concord, Valley Forge, or Yorktown. We imagine patriots fighting for liberty against an oppressive king. What if I told you that right here in St. Augustine, many were cheering for the king? And what if I told you that men who signed the Declaration of Independence were imprisoned inside the Castillo? This is an American Revolutionary War story that most Americans never hear. While the 13 colonies were fighting for independence, Florida fought for the crown. 250 years ago, St. Augustine was a British colony. Many know that there was a 20-year British period from 1763 to 1783. What may not immediately jump out is that this period coincided with the American Revolution. 1775, war erupted between Great Britain and its American colonies. One by one, the colonies joined the rebellion. Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia. But Florida was different. During that time, Florida was not a Spanish territory. It was British. Britain had acquired Florida from Spain only a dozen years earlier, following the French and Indian War. The British divided Florida into two colonies: East Florida, with its capital in St. Augustine, and West Florida, centered around Pensacola. When Revolution broke out, East Florida remained loyal. The colony's leaders depended heavily on British military protection. Many settlers had recently arrived and still identified strongly with the crown. And unlike northern colonies, East Florida had not developed a strong tradition of self-government. As rebellion spread across America, St. Augustine chose a different path. Not revolution, but loyalty. As the war intensified, thousands of Loyalists fled south. These weren't British soldiers. They were Americans, farmers, merchants, plantation owners, families, people who believed the revolution was reckless, dangerous, or simply wrong. Many lost their homes and feared retaliation. For them, St. Augustine was a refuge. The city's population exploded. What had been a small colonial outpost became one of the busiest places in the South. Imagine ships arriving daily, refugees crowding the streets, military patrols everywhere, and government officials, merchants, families desperate to rebuild their lives. For much of the Revolution, St. Augustine became a home for Americans who remained loyal to King George. In a war often described as Americans versus the British, the history here reminds us that many Americans actually fought on Britain's side. Today, we know it as the Castillo de San Marcos. But during the Revolution, the British called it Fort St. Mark, and it served a critical purpose: a base of operations, a supply depot, and a prison for some of the Revolution's most important figures. After the British captured Charleston in 1780, they transported several prominent Patriot leaders to St. Augustine. Among them were three signers of the Declaration of Independence: Thomas Hayward, Arthur Middleton, and Edward Rutledge. Men who had the courage and audacity to sign their names to the document declaring independence from the British Empire were imprisoned inside this fort for nearly a year. Also held here, the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina, Christopher Gadsden, the man associated with the famous "Don't Tread on Me" flag. Unfortunately for him, here in St. Augustine, he was treaded on. While George Washington fought in the North, some of the Revolution's most recognizable names sat behind these walls overlooking the Matanzas Bay, right here in St. Augustine. The Patriots understood how important East Florida was. They knew St. Augustine served as a British military base, so they tried to take it more than once. American forces launched expeditions into Florida hoping to capture the colony and eliminate the British threat to the south. But East Florida proved difficult to conquer. Disease, swamps, heat, logistical problems, and determined British defenses. Again and again, the Patriot campaigns failed. St. Augustine remained British for the entire war. While cities changed hands elsewhere in America, the British flag continued flying over the Castillo. History often gets simplified. We like stories of heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. But reality is usually much more complicated. The American Revolution wasn't simply Americans versus the British. It was also Americans versus Americans, neighbors against neighbors, families divided, and friends choosing different sides. The Loyalists who fled to St. Augustine weren't foreign invaders. Most were Americans. They genuinely believed they were defending order, stability, and lawful government. The Patriots believed they were defending liberty against tyranny. Both sides believed they were right. St. Augustine became one of the most important centers of the Loyalist cause in North America. Then came the surprise. Britain lost the war. The United States won independence. But Florida did not become a part of the United States. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, Britain returned Florida to Spain. After years of supporting the Crown, East Florida suddenly found itself under Spanish rule once again. Many Loyalists packed their belongings and left. Some moved to the Bahamas, others went to Canada, some returned to Britain. The city that had become a Loyalist refuge emptied as quickly as it had filled. And another chapter of St. Augustine's long history began. When visitors walk through St. Augustine today, they usually hear stories about Spanish explorers, pirates, Henry Flagler, or the Civil Rights Movement. There are many interesting and unexpected chapters in St. Augustine, some that are obscure, some forgotten, and others that offend today's politically correct. This chapter is where St. Augustine stood apart from the emerging United States, a chapter where thousands of Americans loyal to the king sought refuge in a little former Spanish colony by the sea. A chapter where signers of the Declaration of Independence became prisoners. The Revolutionary War created the United States. Here in St. Augustine, it created one of the last strongholds of British America. This is a story you won't find in most history textbooks. It is one of those remarkable chapters of American history that makes St. Augustine unlike anywhere else in the nation. Here, history often takes unexpected turns, revealing stories that challenge the simplified narratives we have all heard. The deeper you dig into St. Augustine's past, the more you discover a history that is richer, more complex, and far more fascinating than common knowledge would suggest. If you come down to the Castillo for the 250th celebrations to watch the fireworks, take a moment. Remember the men who were imprisoned here, fighting for what at the time was a new concept: liberty. Something most of us take for granted today, but we all owe a debt of gratitude. Happy 250th birthday, America! The grand experiment continues. Hey, thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more St. Augustine history and content.